Good morning, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. It's a long way to travel for me to come to El Salvador. I'm actually based in Belgium. I'm extraordinarily excited by what's going on here in El Salvador. It feels like there's quite a sort of frontier spirit taking place in El Salvador. There's many minds coming together. There's a fresh, sense in the air. Some of the major sort of things that were holding civilization back have now been lifted. We all know what those are. I don't have to go into them. But of course, as a group of people, the Salvadorians, they're no longer caught in that sort of primal state of fight and flight. And I can feel it in the air. It's palpable. There's this fresh feeling of like, anything's possible. Things can move on from here now. And that's very, very exciting, especially as a sculptor who feels his way through society. I've been feeling my way through society in Belgium. And I don't know if many of you are aware of the situation in Central Europe, but it certainly feels that it's very much stuck. There's a sort of a blockade going on. There's an institutional blockade going on that has a kind of top-down position on culture. They sort of, essentially the way I look at it is anyone with outsider ideas or dreaming of greatness or having this idea of saying, hey, let's keep going, let's do something better, let's do something great. They sort of like, well, no, we'd rather that you just stay quiet. We run the art scene, we say what happens in the cultural scene, and they have this very sort of, stultified kind of view on things. As a sculptor, of course, this has never really computed with me. It's sort of like, well, this sort of mediocrity that was touched on. It's like, but we can go on. We should be able to go on because it's that spirit of creation. It's like an explosion that takes on another explosion. It pushes forward. I believe this is how things should be seen in the arts realm, in the culture realm. So what I wanted to touch on today is really my positioning through the aesthetic realm as a sculptor, feeling his way through culture, but also having a look at this idea of where are we now and where might we go from here? This is a broad question across the West even, but I think it's also a question here too. So I will sort of get into it a little bit. So essentially, I'll give you a little rundown. The sort of sculpture that I'm doing in Belgium has never really been celebrated by the regime. It's never really been sort of accepted or allowed in. There's always been this sort of, well, Fen makes sculpture that doesn't really speak to essentially like the four general motifs. My sculpture doesn't speak to identity politics or gender politics or this idea of sort of like a Greta Thunbergian concept of like climate and how things need to be, brought down and reduced. What I usually like to talk about with my sculpture is like this idea of force and form and this idea of pushing through this stagnation and finding another way forward. I actually thought, maybe naively when I was, making sculpture, that was what artists should be doing, that they should be finding other ways. They should be pushing forward into something else. But that wasn't the case when I had my most recent show and I saw that essentially, the sort of hammer comes down and they say, well, no, you're not allowed to express these things. You're not allowed to talk about force and form. You're not allowed to talk about this sort of dreaming and throwing it forward. That's essentially, in their eyes, committing a fascism, as they would call it, which is the most bizarre thing. And, when you have that hammer come down on you, it's made me as a sculptor now reach this point of, you become activated. You become driven to find another way, to start dreaming of a fresh way. Something that I often think about, because I'm a futurist, and I'm very much inspired by tech, or certain aspects of tech and technology, is that I dream of a rocket-propelled futurism. Now, the Italian futurists were dreaming, they were thinking about the plane and the train and all this kind of stuff, and that was great. But where are we now? Where are we now, and where are we going? There has to be this sort of this force that has to come forward and be thrown forward, and it's interesting because as I've met a number of people in this audience and everyone else here, it's refreshing for me because there's people at least here in El Salvador, collecting on the fringes of, the Western culture that we see today, who are actually starting to dream and starting to throw it forward and say, well, we could actually move forward. We can do something else. We can build something else on the outskirts, on the outside of the current the walls, like barbarians almost, gathering at the gates, in a cultural sense, in an aesthetic sense. Because I've always dreamed essentially of this idea, it's a dynamic vision of man that is always moving forward, always pushing forward with momentum, but unapologetic and confident momentum, not questioning the I have to think about this group or that group or this certain ideological trend or that. It's no, we just keep on going. We keep pushing forward. We don't really care about, these sort of shackles that get thrown upon you in the Western dispensation, as many of you are aware. And then I also think again about the context of what's going on here at Palestra. After all, every great movement of the past and throwing forward has always been a collective of somewhat strange outsider individuals, people who think, philosophers, writers, painters, sculptors. Those are the people that have gathered in the past to actually set a new trend, to set something else, to throw it forward again. I'm often reminded and always thinking about the avant-garde of the 1900s. A show of hands, do you know the Italian futurists? Are you aware of the British vorticists? A lot of what was going on in that time was extraordinary in a sense that you have to always look at, with the Italian futurists, they were able to push away, do their own thing. It didn't take many. A lot of people within the space often think, it's going to take hundreds of people to do something. It's this idea that, we need thousands of people to make a change. But it's actually never really been the case. And I find that a very optimistic thing when being here and speaking to many of you who are really starting to throw it forward and think again. Now, I think it's worth setting the tone when I think about this moment now, and when I ask people and I say, can you think of a great work of art? What do you see in your mind when you think of a great work of art, a great sculpture, a great painting, whatever? Does it ever really happen to be being made or explored by the artists today? Quite often, the answer is no, it's not. I struggle to come up with many different names when I think of, there's a great painter that I know and I hang out with him and he's really inspiring. Or, there's 2 or 3 other sculptors that I hang out with. I don't. It's the honest truth is I don't. I have a really hard time. A lot of the sculptors that I do know in the institutional art scene are kind of lost and still playing with post-Duchampian ideas. They're still cutting things in half. They're still throwing strings and balloons between them. And they're then putting a little bit of politics on top of it. But in real terms, there's no transportation. You're not getting that, that experience where when you view a piece of work and it has that transcendent experience, it takes you and transports you. So we always have to look back, but we are forced then into a sense of nostalgia. We're forced into a sense of nostalgia for the past, but really only because the institutions have really very much kept this kind of strange mist upon the cultural stream. And it's I've taken it upon myself to think, well, we should ultimately keep on going forward. We should ultimately be able to push through this. But you see it now within the institutions, but also the galleries on the street. They're all following the same sort of trend. It's stagnant. It's over. But the answer, the thing that you have to ask is, what is the answer? How do we actually move on from here? Who's working on this stuff? And it's a very nascent scene on our side. There's, things are just starting to accumulate. Stuff's just beginning to come together. And when I think about civilizations of the past, think about the Greeks, you think about the Italian Renaissance, you think about how culture was at the forefront. It was leading. These artists were dreaming. They were throwing this vision forward. They were propelled by this dynamism to keep on moving forward and doing other things and trying stuff out. Just look at American Art Deco, European Art Deco. it still really had some fire in it, still really had some fire in the belly. It's a period that I often look at and sort of go, wow, it wasn't even that long ago and there was still extraordinary things being made. Now, what I think is important to sort of get a view on is where we stand a lot now in this sort of tech-dominant world, this tech-dominant mind, which has this idea of, I speak to a lot of guys in the tech world, and it's like, yeah, we're fixing this problem, we're doing this, and it's ones and zeros, and da-da-da-da-da. And it just feels to me, now don't get me wrong, I love tech, and I'm actually, I'm a futurist. I enjoy all that stuff. But it just feels that it's some way kind of lacks a bit of vision, ultimately. There's a thing that I often like to play with is the idea of noble and ignoble technology. It's like you'll have technology that perhaps can enhance and sort of enhance the specimen, enhance the being. I think of things like, rocket propulsion or certain red light technologies, stuff that will enhance you. And then, of course, there's like the VR headset where you can just sort of disconnect from life and sort of travel into this other world. But it's in real terms, it's kind of, I don't know, I feel the vision there is just really sort of driven by entertainment. It doesn't really have a sort of a greater sort of thing. It reminds me actually in some respects of what I saw when Apple released their recent headset, the Apple Vision Pro or whatever. And it's like, they're sort of showing it off and it's like, yeah, you can watch a big NFL game. It's like, well, big deal. Big deal. It's like, okay, great. So we can, you can sort of watch things, you can be entertained even further in this extraordinarily high-tech thing. What I find very strange is like, why was it not set towards higher things? Why wasn't it set towards like building stuff, like on a considerable leap from technology, by the way, that has already been played around with, like the Microsoft HoloLens 1 and 2, which allowed for the projection of holograms in space, which you could actually really use in sort of like an engineering sense to actually build things and for creatives to genuinely use. So I find that like when thinking about society and thinking about this tech-dominant world, it's always funny because somehow the tech is reaching out. It's reaching out into the sort of furthest position, but somehow this cultural and creative thing is held back. It's not really following with it. It's not coming in. I feel like the biggest problem with this sort of stagnation is that the artists and the creatives are either not being found or they're not being in some way sort of encouraged. There isn't something there to sort of bring an equilibrium between this, because as tech runs too far ahead, we also get this sort of disconnection from reality, disconnection from life, and there is also then this you sort of start to lose the spiritual. You start to lose that spiritual connection in this tech-dominant world, unfortunately. And I've always looked at that and thought, so many people talk about stagnation. So many people have this idea of like, oh, we're stagnating. Things aren't moving forward. But I feel like they should spend a bit more time with artists and creative thinkers, and maybe we'd be able to sort of run forward with that. It seems like, so much time and money and effort is spent into the tech thing, but we're sort of disconnecting from what really speaks to our soul and spirit. And that's where the importance of art actually comes in, or just the practice of art in a genuine sense. Getting into it, sculpting stone, being involved in painting, actually getting into the material. And we have to ask the question as well, why is art actually so important for a civilization? Because in many respects, as this tech-dominant sort of mind pushes further and further ahead, you have to sort of ask this thing of like, what is the importance of it at all? Because there are certain people who will look at it and sort of go, well, I don't really see the importance of this stuff. I've spoken to people like that. They say, well, I don't see the importance of something having a kind of harmony or an order to it. And the way I've always looked at it is that art and the cultural question is this idea that it holds a mirror up to the civilization. It's a tapping in to the mental state of that culture. It's almost like you can see, I often see it almost as like a temperature gauge. It's like, is the body well or is it sick? What's actually going on? And I've often thought about this, quite a bit in the sense that if one were to look in now, at this moment, what would they see? Would they see a healthy society? Would they see a sort of like, oh yeah, they've got their principles and spiritual ideas set down? No, I think they'd see a complete sense of confusion as, again, the majority of the institutions, they dominate this realm, and they perpetuate that confusion, and they don't allow anything else to kind of brew or come together. They ultimately have a kind of zombified institutional culture. There is no room for a growth. And again, of course, I'm one of these believers that there should be a breakaway. There needs to be a breakaway, a building on the outside, as I mentioned previously. But art also acts as the dreamscape of a civilization. It's when you have, for example, a piece of sculpture that stands on a public square or in a garden or whatever, it's a coagulation of principles and ideas, hopes and dreams, and within that, put into that work, put into that bronze work, put into that stone work, it echoes those principles forever. It's singing that song. People who live amongst that will start to notice these things, and they will be able to say, that's who we are. That's us. That speaks to us, our spirit. That speaks to our soul. Now, that's a far cry from where we are now, because we don't have the artists speaking to those principles anymore. It goes down to also the question, what you were mentioning before, with patronage, of course. There was a period, of course, when we had patrons who would be able to look to speak to these things. Very, very important. Brings me on to this idea, of course, of how many people have this strange sort of deep-seated anxiety as they walk through their cities. They walk through, these strange constructed, lifeless towns and cities where they're walking down the road. On their right, there's a strange bit of public sculpture, doesn't speak to them, doesn't lift their spirit. In fact, most of the time, it lowers them. The way I often look at art is it has really two things that it does to me. It either lifts my spirit or it lowers it. The majority of time, unfortunately, in this state, which I think we need to push far beyond, is that I'm lowered. And I think many other people feel that too. So how does this work into, the whole thing of society? How do we start getting into this? What's the genuine importance of it? Is that the art and the cultural question, this idea of brewing a culture that genuinely starts talking to this stuff, has to start going to the forefront again. Culture needs to start going to the forefront. There needs to be that leading force, but there needs to be a fresh vision. There needs to be this other. It's not so much this idea of that you fight on enemy ground when it comes to this. When it comes to this question, I've never believed in this idea of that some people have thrown at me where they say, "But Fen, this postmodern thing. It's like, why don't you play into it? Why don't you just make a more kind of based postmodernism?" And I'm like, why? Why would you do that? Why would you stand on quicksand? We need to exit. We need to get out of this system. We need to build a fresh thing, something that speaks to a raw feeling that is within the zeitgeist on our side, that we can start associating with and understanding. It's something that I found fascinating is that Ezra Pound talks about this idea of the artist as antennae. This idea that they can be an antenna in society and that you can have these artists usually are more sensitive individuals. They can pick up on a certain feeling within a group of people, within a large group of people. And I was having a fascinating conversation about this last night, this idea that there'll be a mass of people within society, in civilization, and they will be going through something, they're feeling something on a deeper level, but they can't put that into words. They can't put that into music. They can't put that into the art, from painting to sculpture. But that's where the artist comes in and is able to then grab that and anchor it and bring it into the space. And then people go, that's what it is. That's what I'm feeling. It's now speaking to the zeitgeist of this sort of moment that, you're having this thing. And that is almost like a release. People find themselves again. They're able to have that, aesthetic transportation. It makes me think about this idea of that through the ordering of material, one reaches the transcendent or one reaches the divine. Because you have the material, you have the piece of sculpture, you have the bronze or stone or whatever, or painting. And the work that's genuinely good, you look at and you're taken on a journey. You momentarily see through that artist's eyes and beyond. And so it's this extraordinary thing that takes place, if it's genuine art. I'm talking about if it's genuine art. Of course, a lot of the stuff that we come across today, hence what I was saying before, everyone is referring back to other works. A lot of the stuff that's being done now doesn't really speak to that. But how is this previously manifested? How has this actually previously come about? And essentially one has to understand that, and I have to relate this to Palestra, breakaway and avant-garde movements, it's never been a mass of people, it's been a small group, a small, energized group of individuals who play off each other. And to that note, I would say, while being here, while being in Palestra, I've had my mind rocked, because I've had people who are speaking at the level that I'm thinking and feeling at, but even beyond. There is an inspiring, there's this electricity in the air, because you see the potential, and you see where people are dreaming and where they're throwing their visions to. And as a sculptor and as an artist, I need that. I require that, and I think other people need that too, especially when you come out of a milieu within the European art scene that has done its best to sort of keep you down and not have you thinking about something greater or something beyond this point. So I'd just like to mention that essentially all of this stuff, I've often had this sort of idea that the mundane has a gravitational pull, and the mundane holds there, and you have these circling standardized ideas, and they're just circling around. And perhaps like myself, I work on a few of these ideas, but I need an acceleration machine. I need to be in a place where these ideas can be accelerated. When I'm around the individuals that are here, those ideas can reach escape velocity from the mundane. They can actually be taken off and pinged off to their furthest extremes. And that's how you start breaking ground. That's how fresh, really, really fresh stuff starts coming about. Because, and I think everyone can relate to this, is that when you're on your own, you might have some ideas and whatever, and you're doing stuff, and you can be very energized, and it's very enjoyable. But it's when you get into other human interaction, and you start meeting with other individuals, that you sort of notice this lift when you're on the same level, that takes you into this higher position. And I believe, actually, this is how you really get, at times, a sort of genius that comes about. Because the way I spoke to a few tech guys in America is it was this idea of almost like an aesthetic R&D, aesthetic research and development, the need for like an aesthetic hacker house, speaking on that level, and the need for a development of a fresh way. And of course, groups of the past have been able to do that, but they've done that in closer proximity. Again, I have to say, Palestra starts to look more and more like somewhat of a sort of house, a sort of artist's house or a hacker house, this idea where you can begin to channel ideas and shoot them off into other areas. Now, I'd like to touch a little bit on this idea of how these ideas and this house and everything, and artists coming together, how it's informed by the idea of patronage, or the patron. And I think Ezra Pound put it in a very, very apt way. If a patron buys from an artist who needs money, the patron then makes himself equal to the artist. He is building art into the world. He creates. Now, this is an interesting topic, because I've spoken to a number of people on the more conservative side, and they sort of look at it as like, I don't want to just throw money at an artist and then walk away and turn my back. And I sort of actually explain, like, that's not really how it goes. It's not about just throwing money at an artist. It's not just this concept of you throw money at a group of artists and then walk away. It's the inspired patron, the one who has vision that he wants to build into the world as well. It's a tandem of things. Going back to the Renaissance, for example, you had the divine patron. You had, the Medicis, or you had the cardinals, or you had the church. You had people with a genuine vision who were wanting to bring certain principles and ideas into coagulation in this world. That is very important, and I think it's going to have to be something that somehow trickles back into the world of arts and creativity. Now, I'd just like to go a little bit into my own, time is running, I'm aware of that. I'd just like to go a little bit into my own process and research here. Essentially what I've been looking at in terms of finding a fresh vein in the sculptural route, the sculptural point, is to use as somewhat of a heuristic this idea of what the cycles were that the Greeks went through. They went through the geometric, the archaic, the classical, and the Hellenistic. The geometric period, everything's a little bit janky. The essence is there. I mean, it's not, it's not highly refined, but the force is there. The power is there. It progresses, of course, as it starts moving into the archaic. It starts to step forward. It starts to grow legs, interestingly enough, and starts to stand. It's going beyond, and there's a little bit more refinement. And then, of course, we start moving into the classical and the Hellenistic. Now, this is a heuristic, sort of basic example that I almost think about when thinking in the realm of finding a fresh aesthetic for sculpture or finding a fresh idea. How do all music bands, for example, start out? It always usually starts out in this sort of janky, we're playing together, but the music isn't that sort of refined. It's kind of got like, there's like a few principles that are coming together, but they're not at that sort of refined level. I sometimes use this idea as like a macro-micro thing. You see it a lot with how like a sculptor will start out with a basic little maquette. It's very rough in the beginning, and then it starts to kind of move forward in evolution. Now, I started to map on this idea that the early modernists from the sort of 1900s, we only ever really saw the geometric. We only ever really saw the basic sort of building blocks of form. There's some refinement there, but it still has this kind of wonderful rock and roll element to it. The power and force is there. And it's an area that I've looked into, of course, is the early 1900s artists, because I never had this idea, although I love Renaissance sculpture and I love the work of the past, I'm actually really just, very much a modernist in the sense that I think that one grabs and throws forward, but we don't even have to look that far back to find sort of, where there was still some real meat, something still that you could really get into. On that note as well, what I found fascinating is that the institutions, the leftist institutions, never wanted this period to be looked at. But on the other side of that, the more sort of conservative-minded individuals also didn't want this side to be looked at. So if you're an artist, you're a sculptor, you most likely want to go and look at those things that both sides of a panel don't necessarily want you to explore, because that's where you go out into the unknown. That's where you could step forth into this sort of chaotic, fresh territory, because, those of you who are aware aesthetically, and with people on our side, will say, well, the work must be, highly refined, or it must be absolutely, this and that. And I never really looked at it that way, because I've always found that, yes, there are certain sculptors who can do the highly refined, but very often, I'm not going to name names, but very often it starts to fall a little bit into the sort of petty pastiche, or perhaps even the nostalgic, which sometimes falls a little flat. There are those who can do it, but so I've sort of had this idea of like, how does one converse? How does one converse with the early modernists? What was I looking at with the Italian futurists, for example? I loved the speed, I loved the power, I loved the force. And they only ever really got to the point of like drawing this stuff out in a janky way. But I saw within it a sort of potency, something that spoke actually very much to this time where we kind of reside in this space that has been expelled from form. So you don't really have this touching on form anymore in a sculptural sense. So I have always looked back at this period and said, it's somewhat like grabbing a geometric hand grenade and hurling it forward into a period in which there is like this vitality and this force and this form they've attempted to occult and get rid of. But I believe it's an important thing to throw forward, because like the Greek heuristic I show, it's finding a place in the geometric again, but it's then how do we move from there? To give you an example of what I played with, I made this very large piece. It was from a 5-ton stone, and I was in conversation actually, which is I think is an important thing to do. I was in conversation with one of the, these drawings that the Italian futurists left us that sort of get passed down to us, and I wanted to make this extraordinarily strong, sort of heavy, just capturing the force, just capturing the power of movement of the motorcycle, but also lifting it up. It was a symbol for momentum. It was this archetype of force and form moving forward, dreaming again, having that idea of, you know, that vital sort of expression. But again, in the geometric, just speaking to that language, trying to find a fresh formation in that place first, because I believe that once you find a formation in the sort of geometric, you can begin building a fresh line. It's not just interpreting a picture online and making it. It's about getting into the DNA of that language. It's about getting into the alphabet of those forms and really attempting to find a fresh way. On that note, I also then worked, it's a little bit further from the geometric than from the sort of motorcycle image. It's taking it a little bit further again. It's looking at the vortices. It's looking at the futurists. It's Prometheus running forward with the fire. He's smashing through. But it's again speaking to this idea that I feel deep inside of me that we're in this stagnation and we must run beyond and crash through onto other ground. And this is a slight step further from the geometric, but it's still within in the geometric. It's still attempting to sort of grab at those things. And then the next works, obviously, that are coming from this is another step forward again. It's finding that fresh vision. And I believe the only way to do that is really to get into the material, get deep into the material. I'm going to stop this now because you guys are going to get motion sick. So I would say, as a conclusion, what's stopping us? Do we just not have it anymore? Or do we? And my belief is we do. We do still have it. And we should still be grabbing at these things and throwing them forward, like our ancestors did, to imagine ourselves again greater in the future, with a greater sort of sense of vitality, with a greater sort of sense of we know who we are and we know where we're going. Thank you very much.